The first time the ground team heard the call sign Flint, they assumed it was a mistake. The voice that came through the radio net was calm, almost clinical, and belonged to someone who didn't sound like they belonged in a warthog cockpit over contested Afghan airspace. The radio crackled with static and urgency as a Marine reconnaissance unit called for immediate close air support. They were pinned in a valley where the shadows stretched long and hostile, where every rock could hide an enemy position. The Tactical Operations Center scrambled to respond, but the closest fast movers were 20 minutes out. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours when rounds were chewing through sandbags and body armor. Then a single transmission cut through the chaos, flat and factual. Reaper 6 Flint, on station in 4 mics. Mark your pose with IR strobe. The controller exchanged glances with his supervisor. Flint wasn't on the air tasking order. Flint wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this sector. And when the A-10 Thunderbolt II broke through the cloud layer, trailing a thin mist of fuel from a punctured wing tank, the Marines on the ground didn't cheer. They stared. The aircraft came in low, impossibly low, its twin engines roaring like something prehistoric and unrelenting. The titanium bathtub that protected the cockpit gleamed dully in the fading light, and the massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon jutted forward like an accusation. It looked wounded, it looked angry, and it refused to leave. The pilot didn't circle high for safety. She dropped into the valley like she owned the air, her voice still calm on the radio as she called out targets with surgical precision. Tally 2 Technicals, North Ridgeline. Tally RPG Team, East Compound. Reaper 6, confirm friendlies marked. The Marines confirmed, their voices tight with adrenaline and something else they couldn't name yet. Maybe disbelief, maybe hope. Flint's first gun run shattered the silence. The sound of the GAU-8 wasn't just heard, it was felt. It vibrated through the earth, through bone, through the certainty that things were bad and getting worse. 30mm rounds tore into enemy positions with ruthless efficiency, each burst a calculated statement of violence delivered with zero hesitation. The technicals erupted in flame. The RPG team scattered and fell. And still the A-10 came around again, fuel streaming behind it in a thin vapor trail that caught the last rays of sunlight. The medics working frantically over wounded Marines paused just long enough to look up. One of them whispered what they were all thinking. "She's bleeding fuel." Another replied, "She's not leaving." And that was when they started to understand. This wasn't a pilot executing a mission. This was something else entirely, something older and more stubborn than doctrine. The radio crackled again, Flint's voice unchanged despite the damage her aircraft had taken. "Reaper 6, talk to me. What else you got?" The ground force commander hesitated before answering, because what he was about to ask felt impossible. His team was surrounded on 3 sides, taking effective fire from entrenched positions that had clear lines of sight on every approach and exit. The valley had become a kill box, and his Marines were the targets. He keyed his mic and spoke with the clipped precision of someone who knew he was asking for a miracle. "Flint, we've got fortified positions on the western ridge, approximately 15 combatants with medium and heavy weapons. Danger close to our pose within 100 meters. There was a pause, not hesitation calculation. Then Flint's voice came back, still that same measured tone that seemed entirely disconnected from the fact that her aircraft was hemorrhaging fuel, and she was flying low enough that small arms fire could reach her. "Copy, danger close. Buddy lays the target. I'll take the first pass from the north." The Joint Terminal Attack Controller, a lance corporal whose hands were steadier than his voice, aimed his laser designator at the enemy position and began feeding coordinates. He'd done this before with F-16s and F-18s, sleek fighters that delivered precision munitions from comfortable altitudes. This was different. This was an A-10 that looked like it had been through a shredder and decided to keep fighting anyway, piloted by someone who was flying like the laws of physics were suggestions, and fear was a language she didn't speak. Flint rolled in from the north, her approach angle aggressive and unconventional. She came in so low that the Marines could see the individual panels of the aircraft's skin, could see where rounds had punched through the tail section and left ragged holes that screamed structural damage. The A-10 wasn't designed to be beautiful. It was designed to absorb punishment and deliver overwhelming firepower, to loiter over the battlefield when faster jets had already gone home. But watching it arc through the valley with that fuel leak trailing behind like a comet's tail, there was something magnificent about its refusal to quit. The gun run was textbook perfect. Flint walked her rounds along the western ridge with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory and countless hours of training that nobody would ever see. The 30mm shells impacted in a tight pattern, each one landing exactly where it needed to, each one reducing enemy cover to shattered rock and silence. The heavy weapons went quiet. The muzzle flashes stopped. And for the first time in an hour, the Marines could breathe without expecting incoming fire. But Flint wasn't done. Reaper 6, I've got eyes on 2 more positions, South Ridge. Appear to be mortar teams setting up. You want me to service those targets? The ground commander looked at his map, then at the sky where that wounded A-10 was circling with a persistence that bordered on suicidal. He knew what he should say. He should tell her to break contact, to get that damaged aircraft to the nearest friendly airfield before the fuel situation became catastrophic. Instead, he said, "Affirm, Flint. You're cleared hot on the mortar positions." She came around again, and this time some of the Marines were watching instead of just listening. They saw the way the A-10 moved through the air, heavy and deliberate, like it was carving its path rather than flying through it. They saw the titanium bathtub catch the light, that armor designed to protect the pilot from ground fire that no other close air support platform could survive. They saw the fuel still streaming from the damaged wing tank, a steady leak that should have sent any rational pilot running for base 10 minutes ago. The radio crackled with the familiar rhythm of close air support coordination, the call and response that had been refined through decades of combat into something almost musical. Target description, pilot acknowledgement, weapons hot, impact, battle damage assessment. But beneath the professional terminology, something else was happening. The Marines were starting to ask questions. Who was Flint? Where had she come from? And why was she still here when her aircraft was clearly compromised? The Lance Corporal with the laser designator voiced what others were thinking. That's got to be an experienced combat pilot. Nobody flies like that without serious time in theater. His squad leader, a staff sergeant with 3 deployments and a chest full of ribbons, shook his head slowly. It's not just experience, it's commitment. She's staying because we need her, not because the mission says so. They watched Flint make another gun run, her approach angle calculated to keep friendly forces outside the danger radius while maximizing impact on the mortar positions. The GAU-8 spoke again, that distinctive sound that enemies learn to fear and friendlies learn to love, the mechanical roar of 30mm rounds being delivered at a rate of nearly 4,000 per minute. The mortar teams disappeared in explosions of dust and shrapnel, their equipment scattered across the ridgeline in pieces too small to be useful anymore. The A-10 pulled up and banked away, trailing that thin stream of fuel that caught the fading sunlight like a question mark written across the sky. Flint's voice came through the radio again, calm as always. "Reaper 6, all visible threats neutralized. You've got a clear path to exfil east. Recommend you move now before they regroup." The ground commander acknowledged, already ordering his team to prepare for movement. But before signing off, he asked the question that was burning in everyone's mind. "Flint, what's your fuel state?" There was a pause longer than before. When she answered, her voice carried the same flat professionalism, but something underneath it suggested she knew exactly how bad her situation was. "Sufficient for escort to your exfil point. After that, we'll see." It wasn't a reassurance. It was a statement of intent. She would stay until the job was done, and the consequences could sort themselves out later. The Marines began their movement east, leapfrogging in fire teams, while Flint maintained a protective orbit overhead. The A-10 circled like a guardian angel made of titanium and depleted uranium, its presence a deterrent to any enemy fighters who might be considering another engagement. The fuel leak had become more visible now, a steady stream that left a shimmer in the air behind the aircraft. The Tactical Operations Center was tracking the situation with growing concern. their radio calls becoming more urgent as they calculated fuel consumption versus distance to the nearest friendly airfield. The senior air controller in the TOC was a major who had coordinated thousands of sorties, and he knew the math wasn't adding up. He keyed into Flint's frequency with careful precision. Flint, Eagle TOC. Recommend immediate RTB to Bagram. You are critically low on fuel with confirmed structural damage. We can vector another asset to cover the ground team. Flint's response was immediate and non-negotiable. Eagle TOC Flint. Negative. I have visual on the ground element and will maintain station until they reach exfil point Bravo. No other assets are currently on station. The major tried again, his voice carrying the weight of command and genuine concern. Flint, you're not going to make it to Bagram if you stay. This is not a request. This time there was a longer pause before Flint responded, and when she did, her voice had dropped into a register that suggested this conversation was over. Eagle TOC understood, remaining on station. In the TOC, the major sat back and exchanged looks with his staff. One of them, a captain who had been listening to the exchange, spoke quietly. "Who is she?" The major pulled up the air tasking order, scrolled through the data, and found the entry. His expression changed as he read the details. Captain Kira Brennan, call sign Flint, 543 combat hours in the A-10, 3 deployments, dust-off missions, close air support, forward air controller work. She flew medevac cover during the Sangin offensive. The captain processed that information. Why Flint? The major had read the file before, had seen the citation that explained the call sign. She flew an A-10 with failing hydraulics and one engine out for 47 minutes to cover a medevac extraction in Helmand Province. When they asked her why she didn't eject, she said she had no intention of leaving sparks behind when there was still fire to deliver. The TOC went quiet. They continued monitoring Flint's orbit, watching the fuel gauge numbers decrease with merciless consistency, listening to her calm coordination with the ground team as they moved through hostile territory towards safety. On the ground, the Marines were making good time, their movement coordinated and professional despite the chaos they just survived. Above them, that damaged A-10 continued its protective circle, and gradually they began to understand what they were witnessing. The exfil point was still 2 kilometers away when the enemy made their move. Fresh fighters, likely a reserve force that had been held back, appeared on the northern ridge with recoilless rifles and heavy machine guns. They opened fire on the Marine column with the kind of disciplined volleys that suggested training and experience. The Marines took cover immediately, their response automatic and well-rehearsed. The ground commander's voice cut through the radio net with controlled urgency. Flint, Reaper 6 taking effective fire from the North Ridge, multiple heavy weapons. We're pinned. Flint didn't acknowledge with words. The A-10 simply rolled inverted and dove toward the ridge with an aggression that seemed to violate every principle of fuel conservation and aircraft preservation. She came in so low that the enemy fighters could see the individual rivets on the aircraft's belly, could see the damage that should have sent her home an hour ago. The GAU-8 opened up with that devastating roar and the ridge erupted in chaos. But this time something changed. As Flint pulled up from the gun run, there was a visible shudder in the aircraft's flight path, a momentary loss of control that suggested systems failing in real time. The fuel leak intensified, becoming a stream instead of a mist, and for the first time her voice on the radio carried an edge of strain. Reaper 6, northern threat neutralized. You're clear to continue movement. The ground commander heard what wasn't being said. Flint, what's your status? There was a pause filled with the sound of her breathing through the radio, audible now when it hadn't been before. Multiple hydraulic warnings. Flight controls degraded but functional, fuel state critical, continuing escort. It was insane. It was exactly what they needed. The Marines moved faster now, their pace urgent as they realized what she was sacrificing to keep them covered. The A-10 continued its orbit, but the circles were wider now, the movements less precise. Flint was compensating for failing systems with pure pilot skill, keeping that wounded aircraft in the air through force of will and muscle memory. The Lance Corporal with the laser designator watched the A-10 struggle through its orbit and spoke quietly to his squad leader. "She's not going to make it back, is she?" The staff sergeant kept his eyes on their route ahead. "Probably not. But she's going to make sure we do." That realization rippled through the Marine column like electricity. This wasn't just close air support. This was a pilot choosing their survival over her own safety, making calculations that had nothing to do with regulations and everything to do with the oldest military tradition. No one gets left behind. Flint made one more gun run, this one against a technical that appeared on the eastern approach, trying to cut off the Marines' path to the exfil point. The A-10 shook violently as she fired, the airframe protesting the stress being placed on compromised systems. But the 30mm rounds found their mark, and the technical exploded in a fireball that cleared the eastern route completely. The Marines reached exfil Point Bravo as the sun touched the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed appropriate for the violence they'd survived. The extraction helicopters were inbound, their rotors already audible in the distance. Overhead, Flint's A-10 circled one last time, the fuel leak now visible even from the ground as a dark trail against the evening sky. The ground commander keyed his radio for what he knew might be the last time. "Flint, Reaper 6. All personnel at exfil Point Bravo. Extraction birds are inbound. You are cleared to RTB." There was a long pause before Flint responded, and when she did, her voice carried exhaustion that professionalism could no longer completely mask. "Reaper 6, Flint. Glad you made it. Proceeding to Bagram." The major in the Tactical Operations Center had been running calculations continuously, and the numbers were brutal. He keyed into her frequency with urgency. "Flint, Eagle TOC. Be advised you are below bingo fuel. Nearest emergency field is Salerno, bearing 0905, distance 43 kilometers. Recommend immediate divert." Flint's response was immediate. "Eagle TOC negative. Flight controls are degraded. Salerno's approach requires mountain navigation I can't guarantee with current hydraulics. Continuing to Bagram." The major understood what she wasn't saying. Bagram had a long, wide runway and better emergency response. It was also another 60 kilometers beyond Salerno. The fuel math didn't work, but mountain approaches with failing hydraulics didn't work either. She was choosing the option that gave her the best chance, knowing that all her chances were bad. In the TOC, the staff watched her transponder track across their screens, measuring her progress in kilometers that seemed to pass too slowly while fuel burned too fast. The captain who had asked about her earlier spoke quietly. "She's not going to make it." The major didn't disagree. Instead, he began coordinating emergency response procedures with Bagram Tower, alerting crash rescue teams, clearing the runway, preparing for outcomes that nobody wanted to speak aloud. On the ground at exfil Point Bravo, the Marines loaded onto the extraction helicopters with efficiency born from repetition. But they moved quietly, many of them scanning the darkening sky for that damaged A-10 they could no longer see. The staff sergeant who had understood Flint's commitment gathered his team and spoke with unusual gravity. "Remember this. Remember what she did. When someone asks you about close air support, you tell them about Flint." The helicopters lifted off, carrying the Marines away from the valley that had nearly become their grave. As they climbed toward safer altitude, some of them could see the thin contrail in the distance, barely visible against the fading light, marking Flint's desperate flight toward Bagram and a runway that might as well have been on the moon. Flint was 40 kilometers from Bagram when the first engine flamed out. The A-10 was designed to fly on one engine, built with redundancy that acknowledged combat damage as inevitable rather than exceptional. But she had been nursing damaged hydraulics and bleeding fuel for over an hour, and the systems were cascading toward failure with mechanical inevitability. Her breathing was audible on the radio now, controlled but labored as she worked the flight controls with both hands and physical strength, compensating for hydraulic pressure that was dropping toward zero. The tower at Bagram had cleared all traffic, rolled emergency vehicles, and alerted medical teams. The air boss was a lieutenant colonel who had overseen thousands of landings, and he spoke to Flint with the calm authority of someone who knew panic helped nothing. "Flint, Bagram Tower. Runway 32 cleared and ready. Winds light and variable. Crash crew is in position. Call your final." Flint's voice came back strained. "Bagram Tower, Flint. Single engine, hydraulics at minimum pressure, fuel showing 0. I've got the runway visual." The lieutenant colonel kept his voice steady. "Roger, Flint. You're cleared to land any runway, any direction. Your call." That was the emergency authorization, the acknowledgement that normal procedures were suspended, and survival was the only metric that mattered. Flint didn't waste words on acknowledgement. She was flying the A-10 manually now, using trim tabs and throttle and physical pressure on controls that wanted to freeze in place. The aircraft was a glider with one functioning engine, descending toward a runway that seemed to recede as fast as she approached it. In the tower, the operations staff watched through binoculars as the A-10 emerged from the darkness, visible only by its navigation lights and the glow from the engine that was still running. The lieutenant colonel had his radio key pressed, ready to guide her in when one of his controllers spoke quietly. "Sir, she's too low. At that descent rate, she won't clear the perimeter wall." He didn't contradict the assessment because it was accurate. Flint was coming in steep and fast, her approach angle dictated by failing systems rather than choice. She would either clear the wall or she wouldn't, and there was nothing anyone could do to change that equation now. The Marines who had been extracted from the valley were being processed through the base medical facility when word spread about Flint's emergency approach. The staff sergeant gathered whoever would listen and led them outside, toward the flight line where they could see the runway. They stood in silence, watching the sky, waiting. Flint cleared the perimeter wall with less than 5 meters to spare, the A-10's landing gear missing the concrete barrier by a margin that existed more in hope than measurement. She touched down hard on the runway centerline, the impact violent enough to collapse the damaged landing gear strut on the left side. The A-10 slewed sideways, trailing sparks and pieces of metal as it ground across the runway surface, with the sound of structural failure echoing across the airfield. The crash crew was moving before the A-10 stopped sliding, their vehicles racing toward the aircraft with practiced urgency. The Warthog came to rest 30 meters from the center line, tilted at an angle on its collapsed gear, fuel pooling underneath from ruptured tanks that had finally given up their fight against gravity and damage. The canopy opened immediately, and Flint extracted herself with the efficient movements of someone who had rehearsed emergency egress until it was instinctive. She climbed down from the canted cockpit, refused assistance from the first responder who reached her, and stood looking at her aircraft for a long moment. The A-10 was a mess, bullet holes stitched across the tail section, the left wing tank completely shredded, hydraulic fluid and fuel dripping from multiple punctures. The landing gear collapsed, the engine cowling damaged from the flameout. It looked like something that should have fallen from the sky an hour ago, held together by nothing but titanium armor and stubborn engineering. The lieutenant colonel arrived in a command vehicle, stepping out with the expression of someone who had seen many damaged aircraft but few pilots who had pushed this far past reasonable limits. He approached Flint, who was still staring at the Warthog, and spoke with careful neutrality. "Captain Brennan, are you injured?" She turned to face him, her flight suit stained with hydraulic fluid and sweat, her expression showing the exhaustion that adrenaline could only mask for so long. "No, sir. Aircraft's a bit worn, though." The lieutenant colonel almost smiled. "That's one description. The maintenance chief is going to have others." He paused, then asked the question that protocol required. "Why did you stay on station after you took damage? You had authorization to RTB immediately." Flint looked back at the A-10, then at the lieutenant colonel, and her answer was simple. "Marines needed cover. I had ordnance and fuel. The math worked until it didn't." It was the answer of a pilot who understood that mission completion and personal safety sometimes occupied different spaces, and who had chosen which one mattered more. The lieutenant colonel nodded slowly. "Understood. Debrief is scheduled for 0900 tomorrow. Get checked by medical, get some rest." Flint acknowledged and started walking toward the medical facility, each step careful as the adrenaline began to wear off, and the physical cost of the last 2 hours caught up with her body. Behind her, the maintenance crews were already swarming over the A-10, documenting damage, assessing repairs, shaking their heads at the extent of the abuse the airframe had absorbed. The staff sergeant and his Marines were waiting outside the medical facility when Flint approached. They had no official reason to be there, no protocol that brought ground forces and pilots together after missions. But they stood in a loose formation anyway, coming to attention as she walked past. The staff sergeant spoke clearly. "Ma'am, Reaper 6 and team, we wanted to say thank you." Flint stopped, turned to face the Marines, and something in her expression softened in a way that combat hadn't allowed. She looked at faces that were still painted with camouflage, at uniforms that were torn and dirty, at young men who had come within meters of not making it home. When she spoke, her voice had lost the flat professionalism of radio communications and carried something more personal. "You don't need to thank me. That's the job." The staff sergeant shook his head slightly. "Respectfully, ma'am, the job was close air support. What you did was a lot more than that." The lance corporal with the laser designator spoke up, his voice carrying the intensity of someone who needed to say something that had been building since he watched that damaged, refused to leave. "We heard the tower telling you to break off. We heard the fuel warnings. You stayed anyway." Flint looked at him, at all of them, and her answer was simple and true. "You were pinned. You needed cover. I had the capability to provide it. Everything else was just details." But the Marines understood that the details had included her aircraft falling apart around her, fuel bleeding into the sky, systems failing in sequence, and a landing approach that had come within meters of catastrophic failure. Those weren't small details. Those were the difference between completing the mission and survival, and she had chosen the mission every single time. The staff sergeant came to a decision. "Ma'am, we'd like to submit a commendation for your actions today. Bronze Star with V device at minimum." Flint shook her head immediately. "That's not necessary. File your after-action report accurately and that's sufficient." The staff sergeant persisted. "With respect, ma'am, our after-action report is going to be accurate. And accuracy requires documenting that you stayed on station with critical damage, provided danger-close fire support multiple times, and escorted us to exfil despite fuel state that should have sent you to the nearest emergency field an hour earlier." She studied his face, saw the determination there, and recognized that this wasn't about protocol or decorations. This was about Marines who needed to acknowledge what had been done for them, who needed some way to mark the difference between routine support and someone choosing to risk everything. Finally, she nodded. "If that's what your accurate report requires, I won't interfere with it, but I didn't do anything that any other A-10 pilot wouldn't have done in the same situation." The lance corporal spoke quietly, almost to himself. "I don't think that's true, ma'am." Flint didn't argue further. She was too tired, and maybe some part of her recognized that they needed this conversation more than she did. She offered a slight nod, then continued toward the medical facility while the Marines watched her go, already composing the report that would eventually work its way through the chain of command with the weight of witnessed truth. The debriefing the next morning was attended by more senior officers than a standard close air support mission warranted. The conference room held a colonel from the Air Operations Group, the lieutenant colonel from the tower, a major from maintenance, and 2 officers from the Safety Investigation Board. Flint sat across from them in a clean flight suit, having been cleared by medical with nothing more than bruised ribs and muscle strain from fighting the damaged flight controls. The colonel opened with the directness of someone who had read the preliminary reports and found them difficult to believe. "Captain Brennan, walk us through your decision-making process after you sustain battle damage." Flint recounted the sequence of events with the same flat precision she had used on the radio, describing the damage assessment, the fuel leak rate, the calculation that she had sufficient reserves to provide support until the ground team reached exfil. She detailed each gun run, each radio call, each system degradation as they occurred. The safety board officer interrupted with the question that had been bothering him since he reviewed the flight data recorder. "Captain, At what point did you consider ejecting? Flint's answer was immediate. When the aircraft became unflyable. That didn't occur until after landing. The major from maintenance spoke up, having spent the night reviewing the damaged A-10. Captain, your aircraft had 73 separate impacts from small arms fire and shrapnel. The left wing tank was completely compromised. You lost hydraulic pressure in 2 of 3 systems. The fuel quantity indicating system was damaged and giving you inaccurate readings. You were probably running on fumes for the last 20 kilometers. At what point was the aircraft unflyable? Flint considered that carefully before answering. As long as I had control authority and sufficient fuel to maintain airspeed, the aircraft was flyable. Damaged, yes. Compromised, absolutely. But flyable. The colonel leaned forward. Captain Brennan, I've flown the A-10 for 15 years. What you described doing with failed hydraulics and manual reversion is barely possible in ideal conditions. Doing it while conducting multiple gun runs in a contested valley is effectively impossible. Flint met his gaze steadily. Sir, the Marines on the ground needed fire support. I was the only available asset. Impossible wasn't relevant to the situation. There was a long silence in the room. The safety board officer reviewed his notes, the maintenance major looked at his damage report, and the colonel sat back in his chair with an expression that suggested he was reassessing something fundamental. Finally, the lieutenant colonel from the tower spoke. Captain, off the record, why did you choose Bagram over Salerno when Salerno was closer and you were critically low on fuel? Flint's answer was tactically sound and personally revealing. Salerno requires a mountain approach with tight navigation. My hydraulics were degraded to the point where I couldn't guarantee precise control inputs. Bagram has a longer runway and straightened approach. It gave me the best probability of a controlled landing. The colonel nodded slowly, then made a decision. Captain Brennan, pending the Safety Investigation Board's final report, you're grounded from flight operations. That's standard procedure following this level of damage and emergency landing. Flint had expected this. Understood, sir. The colonel continued, his tone shifting slightly. You should also know that the ground force commander has submitted a recommendation for Bronze Star with Combat V. The Air Group commander is reviewing it, along with several other citations that are apparently being prepared by personnel who witnessed your actions. Flint's expression didn't change. I appreciate that, sir, but it wasn't necessary. The maintenance major spoke up again, this time with something like admiration in his voice. Captain, I've been maintaining A-10s for 12 years. What you brought back last night should not have been able to fly. The fact that it did, and that you kept it flying for as long as you did, is remarkable. The safety board officer added his perspective. The flight data recorder shows you maintained controlled flight with essentially no hydraulic pressure for the final 15 minutes. The manual describes that condition as requiring immediate ejection. Can you explain how you maintained control? Flint's answer was technical and understated. Trim tabs, differential thrust, and physical pressure on the stick. The A-10 is designed with enough control redundancy that if you understand the systems well enough, you can compensate for failures. The colonel allowed himself a slight smile. That's the textbook answer, Captain. But the textbook doesn't usually include flying damaged aircraft through contested airspace while providing close air support. Flint didn't respond to that. There wasn't much to say. She had done what the situation required, using the training and aircraft capabilities available, and the fact that she had pushed past normal limits was simply the result of circumstances that demanded it. The debriefing continued for another hour, covering every aspect of the mission, every decision point, every moment where doctrine said one thing and reality demanded another. When it finally concluded, the colonel stood and the others followed. Captain Brennan dismissed. Remain available for follow-up questions from the safety board, and get some rest, you've earned it. Flint came to attention, saluted, and left the conference room. Outside, the Afghan sun was already climbing toward midday heat, and the air base was operating with its usual controlled chaos. She walked toward the squadron-ready room, processing the debriefing, already thinking about the written statement she would need to prepare. She didn't think about decorations or commendations. Those were administrative outcomes that mattered to people who tracked career progression. What mattered was that the Marines had made it to their exfil point, that nobody had been left behind, and that the A-10 had done exactly what it was designed to do: survive impossible damage and keep fighting until the mission was complete. The story of what happened in that Afghan valley spread through the aviation community with the speed of something that challenged assumptions. In ready rooms across the theater, pilots discussed Flint's actions with a mixture of professional respect and personal disbelief. The A-10 community, already tight-knit and protective of their unglamorous but essential aircraft, claimed the story as validation of everything they believed about the Warthog's capabilities. But it was the ground forces who told the story differently. For them, it wasn't about aircraft capabilities or pilot skill in abstract terms. It was about watching someone refuse to leave when leaving was the rational choice, about hearing that calm voice on the radio while fuel bled into the sky, about the sound of the GAU-8 delivering violence on their behalf when violence was all that stood between them and catastrophic casualties. The staff sergeant submitted his after-action report exactly as he had promised, documenting each moment of the engagement with the precision of someone who understood that words on paper would never fully capture what had happened, but that accuracy was still essential. He described the initial contact, the desperate call for air support, Flint's arrival in a visibly damaged aircraft, her decision to remain on station despite clear fuel and hydraulic problems, and the multiple gun runs that had been executed with danger-close precision while her A-10 fell apart around her. The report went through channels, accumulating endorsements and additional witness statements as it climbed. The Marine Company commander added his perspective. The battalion commander added his assessment. The regimental commander, a colonel with 30 years of service, added a personal note about the level of commitment demonstrated exceeding what doctrine required or regulations anticipated. The Bronze Star recommendation grew into something larger, the V device for valor becoming the central recognition of actions that had moved past routine heroism into something that needed to be marked and remembered. While the administrative processes ground forward with military bureaucracy's peculiar combination of speed and delay, Flint remained grounded and focused on the technical requirements of the safety investigation. She provided detailed written statements about each system failure, each decision point, each moment where she had chosen to continue rather than abort. The safety board reviewed the wreckage of her A-10, documented the damage with photographs and measurements, and slowly assembled a picture of an aircraft that had been held together by engineering margins that existed exactly for the scenario that had unfolded. The maintenance crews worked on the damaged Warthog with something approaching reverence, cataloging each impact, each hole, each system that had failed, and each one that had somehow continued to function. They found evidence of impacts that had missed critical components by millimeters, of redundant systems that had operated exactly as designed, of an airframe that had absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. The chief master sergeant in charge of maintenance stood beside the damaged A-10 one evening and spoke to his senior technicians with unusual gravity. "This is what the aircraft was built for. Remember that when people question why we still fly these things." 3 weeks after the mission, the citations and commendations were finalized. The Bronze Star with V device was approved, along with a cluster of other awards recognizing specific actions during the engagement. Flint received notification through official channels, the paperwork arriving with the expected military efficiency that turned extraordinary actions into formatted documents and regulation-sized metal cases. The presentation ceremony was scheduled for the following week, timed to coincide with a visit from the division commander who wanted to personally recognize the actions. Flint didn't request that it be canceled, but she didn't look forward to it either. Award ceremonies were necessary military theater, moments where individual actions were held up as examples and institutional values were reinforced through public recognition. She understood their purpose, but that didn't make them comfortable. The Marines from Reaper 6 were invited to attend, and the staff sergeant made sure his entire team was present. They stood in formation in their dress uniforms, the contrast stark against the memory of them in torn combat gear covered in dust and blood. The ceremony was held on the flight line, with Flint's repaired A-10 serving as backdrop. The maintenance crews had worked miracles, replacing damaged components, repairing the airframe, restoring systems, until the aircraft was once again mission-capable. It bore the scars of that day in the form of patched holes and replaced panels, but it was ready to fly again. The division commander was a major general who had started his career flying helicopters in Desert Storm, and who understood combat aviation from personal experience rather than administrative oversight. He read the citation with appropriate gravity, describing the actions in language that tried to capture the reality of sustained engagement while critically damaged, of choosing mission completion over personal safety, of maintaining station until friendly forces were secure. When he pinned the bronze star on Flint's uniform, he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "You represented the best traditions of military aviation. Well done, Captain." Flint responded with equal quietness. "Thank you, sir, just doing the mission." The general smiled slightly. "That's what everyone who earns one of these says, doesn't make it less true." After the ceremony, the Marines approached Flint with the awkwardness of people who wanted to express gratitude but weren't sure how protocol allowed. The staff sergeant solved the problem by extending his hand and speaking simply. "Ma'am, we're alive because of what you did. Thank you." Flint shook his hand, then each of the other Marines in turn, seeing in their faces the weight of shared experience that was already beginning to fade into memory and story. The lance corporal who had directed her gun run spoke with the earnest intensity of youth. "Ma'am, I'm going to tell my kids about this someday, about watching an A-10 refuse to quit." Flint smiled at that. "Tell them about the aircraft. Tell them the A-10 is built to take damage and keep flying. That's the real story." But the lance corporal shook his head. "Respectfully, ma'am, the aircraft did what it was built to do because you made it. That's the story." Flint didn't argue further. She was learning that people needed their stories to have certain shapes, needed to see individual will and determination because those were qualities they could understand and aspire to. The technical reality of aircraft systems and redundancy engineering was less satisfying than the narrative of a pilot who refused to quit. As the ceremony broke up and personnel returned to their regular duties, the Major General pulled Flint aside for a private conversation. They walked away from the crowd, toward the repaired A-10 that sat on the flight line like a monument to stubborn engineering. The general spoke with the directness of someone who had earned the right to bypass formality. "Captain Brennan, I've read your entire file. This isn't your first time pushing past reasonable limits to complete a mission." Flint acknowledged that carefully. "No, sir," the general continued. "In Helmand Province, you flew an A-10 with one engine and failing hydraulics for 47 minutes to cover a medevac extraction. That's what earned you the call sign Flint Sparks that refused to go out even when the fire should be done." Flint hadn't known he had read back that far into her record. "Yes, sir." The general looked at the A-10, at the patches and repairs that marked where it had absorbed damage that should have been fatal. "There's a pattern in your file, Captain. When you're the only asset available and ground forces need support, you stay until the mission is complete. You don't calculate exit strategies or preserve your aircraft. You do what's necessary and deal with consequences afterward." Flint considered how to respond to that because it was both an accurate assessment and potentially a criticism of judgment. "Sir, in both cases, the tactical situation required continued presence. I had capability to provide support, so I did." The general nodded slowly. "I'm not criticizing your judgment, Captain. I'm acknowledging your commitment, but I'm also going to be direct with you about something." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "This kind of flying has a cost. You can't sustain it indefinitely. Eventually, the aircraft won't make it back, or the damage will be worse than bruised ribs and muscle strain. You understand that, right?" Flint met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir, I understand that." The general studied her for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. Good, because the Air Force needs pilots like you, but we need you alive and flying, not dead because you pushed one mission too far. Remember that ground forces need continuing support, not one perfect mission followed by nothing. It was the kind of guidance that only senior officers who had seen too many talented people die could deliver, mixing recognition with warning in equal measure. Flint took the general's words seriously because they came from experience rather than theory. But she also knew that the nature of close air support meant that decisions had to be made in real time, with incomplete information, and that sometimes the gap between what doctrine recommended and what the situation required was a space where individual judgment made the difference between casualties and survival. The Safety Investigation Board completed their review 2 weeks later, their findings a mixture of technical analysis and institutional concern. They documented every system failure, every moment where Flint had compensated for degraded capabilities, every decision point where she had chosen to continue rather than abort. Their conclusion was carefully worded. Her actions had been technically justified given the tactical situation, but they represented an extreme edge case that should not be considered standard procedure. The report recommended enhanced training on damage assessment and risk calculation, additional emphasis on pilot safety in close air support doctrine, and a review of fuel management procedures for extended combat operations. It stopped short of criticizing Flint's judgment, but it made clear that her actions existed in territory where military necessity and personal safety had diverged in ways that made senior leaders uncomfortable. Flint read the report with the detachment of someone who understood institutional thinking. The Air Force needed rules and procedures that applied across thousands of pilots and countless situations. Her mission had been an outlier, a statistical edge case where normal parameters didn't apply. The fact that she had survived and completed the mission didn't mean that replicating her actions was advisable for the broader force. She returned to flight status 6 weeks after the mission, going through the standard requalification process with instructors who knew her record and who watched her fly with heightened attention. She performed flawlessly because muscle memory and training didn't fade in 6 weeks, and because the A-10 responded to her inputs with the familiarity of an instrument she had mastered through hundreds of hours of practice. The squadron commander cleared her for combat operations with a conversation that mixed welcome with caution. "Glad to have you back, Flint. Try to bring the aircraft home in better shape this time," she acknowledged with appropriate seriousness. "Will do, sir," and she meant it. But she also knew that if she found herself in another situation where Marines were pinned and she was the only available asset, the calculation would be the same. Mission first, aircraft second, personal safety third. That was the hierarchy that close air support demanded, and changing it would require changing who she was at a fundamental level. The Marines from Reaper 6 rotated home 3 months later, their deployment complete. Before they left, the staff sergeant made one final visit to the Air Operations Center, asking to speak with Captain Brennan. They met in the squadron-ready room, where Flint was reviewing mission planning for the next day's sorties. The staff sergeant stood at attention despite this being an informal visit, his respect for what she had done manifesting in military courtesy. "Ma'am, Reaper 6 is rotating back to the States tomorrow. Wanted to say goodbye and thank you one more time before we left." Flint stood and shook his hand, seeing in his face the changes that deployment carved into everyone who survived it. "Congratulations on making it home, Staff Sergeant. You and your team did excellent work out there." He smiled slightly. "We did our job, ma'am, but we're only here to do it again because you did yours." There wasn't much to say to that, so Flint simply nodded. The staff sergeant continued, choosing his words carefully. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about that day in the valley, about what you said when we thanked you, that it was just the job. I understand why you said that, but I want you to know something." He paused, making sure she was listening. "It might have been the job, but the way you did it, staying when you should have left, making those gun runs with fuel bleeding everywhere, landing that aircraft when it barely had wings, That was more than just the job. That was choosing us over yourself. And every Marine in that valley knows it and will remember it. Flint felt the weight of his words, the sincerity behind them, and recognized that this was important to him in ways that transcended protocol or regulation. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant. That means something." He nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small item wrapped in cloth. "The team wanted to give you something. It's not official, not authorized, probably violates a dozen regulations, but it's from us." He handed her the cloth-wrapped item. Flint unfolded it to reveal a challenge coin, custom-made. One side showed an A-10 silhouette trailing fuel with Flint inscribed below. The other side bore the Marine Corps emblem and the words, "Reaper 6, no one left behind." It was exactly the kind of unauthorized memento that military units created to mark events that official recognition couldn't fully capture. Flint held the coin carefully, understanding its significance. "Thank you, I'll keep this." The staff sergeant came to attention one final time. "Safe flying, ma'am. If we ever need close air support again, I hope it's you on the other end of that radio." Flint returned the attention. "Safe journeys home, Staff Sergeant. Take care of your Marines." He left, and Flint sat back down at her desk, holding the challenge coin and thinking about the strange mathematics of military service, where doing your job well enough could mean the difference between strangers going home to their families or being shipped back in flag-draped boxes. The weight of that responsibility never got lighter, but the coin in her hand was proof that sometimes the burden was shared and recognized and marked with symbols that had no official standing, but carried their own authority. 6 months later, Flint was still flying combat missions over Afghanistan, accumulating hours and sorties with the steady persistence that characterized her approach to military aviation. She had been involved in dozens of close air support missions since returning to flight status, each one executed with professional competence, none of them requiring the extreme measures that had defined that day in the valley. But the story had spread, and now when she checked in on the radio net, ground forces who had heard about the A-10 pilot who refused to leave responded with a confidence that came from knowing her reputation. Call signs were supposed to be just identifiers, radio shorthand devoid of deeper meaning. But Flint had become something more, a signal that the pilot on station understood what ground forces needed and would deliver it regardless of cost. It was a reputation that brought its own pressure, an expectation that she would always be willing to push past limits, that she would never be the one to say the risk was too high. Flint was aware of this dynamic and understood its dangers. Reputation could become a cage, forcing actions that served the legend rather than the mission. But she also understood that trust between air and ground was built on demonstrated commitment, and that sometimes living up to a reputation was simply the continuation of principles she had always held. The squadron commander called her into his office one morning for what she assumed would be routine tasking. Instead, he closed the door and gestured for her to sit with an expression that suggested this was something different. "Flint, I received an interesting communication from higher headquarters yesterday. They're considering you for an assignment to the A-10 weapons school as an instructor." Flint processed that information carefully. The weapons school was where the Air Force trained its most skilled pilots to become experts in tactical employment, the ones who would return to squadrons and raise the overall capability of the force. It was prestigious, demanding, and would take her out of combat operations for at least 2 years. "Sir, I appreciate the consideration, but I'd prefer to remain in the squadron." The commander had expected this response. "I figured you'd say that, but hear me out before you dismiss it. The weapons school needs instructors who don't just understand the academic theory but who have demonstrated the practical reality of what this aircraft can do under extreme conditions. Your experience, both the technical skills and the judgment to employ them in combat, is exactly what they're looking for." Flint understood the logic, but she also knew herself well enough to recognize that she belonged in the cockpit more than the classroom. "Sir, with respect, there are other qualified pilots who would be better suited for instruction." The commander leaned back in his chair. Maybe. But none of them flew an A-10 with 73 bullet holes and failing hydraulics while providing danger-close fire support until their fuel gauge read empty. That kind of experience is worth teaching to the next generation. He paused, then continued. I'm not ordering you to take the assignment, but I am strongly encouraging you to consider it. Flint spent 3 days considering the weapons school assignment before making her decision. She flew her scheduled missions, worked through her routine duties, and thought about what she wanted from the next phase of her career. The practical arguments for accepting were sound. Teaching at the weapons school would broaden her influence, allow her to shape how the next generation of A-10 pilots approached close air support, and potentially extend her career beyond the physical demands of continuous combat flying. But every time she sat in the cockpit and felt the aircraft respond to her inputs, every time she heard ground forces calling for support and knew she could provide it, the decision to leave felt wrong. On the 4th day, she gave the squadron commander her answer. "Sir, I appreciate the opportunity, but I'd like to respectfully decline. I believe I can contribute more effectively by remaining in a tactical squadron." The commander had anticipated this but tried one more approach. "Flint, you're one of the most experienced A-10 pilots in theater. At some point, that experience becomes more valuable to the Air Force if it's shared rather than just applied individually." Flint met his gaze steadily. "Sir, I understand that perspective, but I also know that ground forces trust Flint on the radio because they know I'll stay until the mission is complete. Building that trust takes time and demonstrated commitment. I'm not ready to walk away from that yet." The commander studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Captain, I'll inform higher headquarters that you've declined, but understand that this kind of opportunity doesn't come around often and your decision to stay tactical has a shelf life. Eventually, the Air Force is going to need you in other roles." Flint acknowledged that reality. "Understood, sir. When that time comes, I'll adapt, but right now, this is where I need to be." The conversation ended there, and Flint returned to her regular duties, knowing she had chosen the harder path. Staying tactical meant continuing to fly missions where damage and danger were possibilities, where every sortie carried risks that instruction would have eliminated. But it also meant continuing to do the work that felt most aligned with why she had wanted to fly the A-10 in the first place. 2 weeks later, she was on station over a valley in Kunar province when a special operations team made contact with a larger enemy force and called for immediate air support. Flint responded with the same calm professionalism that had characterized her previous missions, coordinating with the ground controller, identifying targets, delivering ordnance with precision that came from countless hours of practice. The mission was textbook successful, no damage taken, no extraordinary measures required. Just professional close air support executed exactly as trained. But as she flew back to base with full fuel and undamaged systems, she thought about the weapons school assignment she had declined and felt certain she had made the right choice. This was her contribution, her place in the larger machinery of military operations. Teaching others was valuable, but being the one on station when the call came in mattered in a way that was immediate and tangible. A year after the mission in the valley that had earned her the Bronze Star, Flint was approaching the end of her deployment rotation. She had accumulated over 700 combat hours in the A-10, flown more than 200 missions, and built a reputation that extended beyond her squadron to the broader military community in Afghanistan. Ground forces requesting close air support would sometimes specifically ask if Flint was available, a preference that violated normal tasking procedures, but that controllers accommodated when possible because they understood the trust it represented. The squadron held a going-away gathering for pilots rotating home, an informal event where war stories were shared and connections were acknowledged before everyone dispersed to their next assignments. Flint attended with the same quiet presence she brought to most social situations, listening more than talking, comfortable in the background despite being one of the most decorated pilots in the room. The squadron commander raised a glass and offered a toast that was both sincere and carefully worded. To the pilots rotating home, you've represented the best of what the A-10 community stands for. You've provided close air support when it mattered most, you've brought your aircraft back when others would have ejected, and you've built trust with ground forces that will last long after you leave. Safe travels home, and know that you've made a difference here. The room echoed the toast, and Flint drank with the others while thinking about what making a difference actually meant in the context of a conflict that had been ongoing for over a decade and showed no signs of reaching conclusion. Individual missions succeeded or failed, aircraft came back damaged or undamaged, ground forces survived or didn't. But the larger war continued with a momentum that individual actions could barely influence. Still, there was value in the individual missions, even if the strategic outcome remained uncertain. The Marines who had made it out of that valley were alive because she had stayed on station. The Special Operations Team in Kunar had completed their mission because she had been available to provide support. Those weren't strategic victories, but they were real outcomes that mattered to the people involved. The next morning, Flint packed her gear, completed her checkout procedures, and walked across the flight line one final time before boarding the transport that would begin her journey home. She paused near her assigned A-10, the aircraft that had been repaired after that mission a year ago and had flown flawlessly through dozens of subsequent sorties. The crew chief responsible for the aircraft saw her standing there and approached with the casual familiarity that developed between pilots and maintainers. "Going to miss having you around, ma'am. You were always good about bringing the aircraft back in one piece." Flint smiled slightly at that. "Except for that one time." The crew chief grinned. "Except for that one time, but you brought it back and that's what counts. Some pilots would have punched out and left us with a crater. You fought to save the aircraft." Flint shook his hand. "You and your team did excellent work keeping these birds flying. Thank you for that." The flight home was a series of military transports moving her progressively further from the combat zone and closer to the United States, each leg a step in the transition from deployed operations back to garrison life. Flint used the time to decompress, to process the experiences of the deployment, and to think about what came next. She had orders to a stateside A-10 squadron, where she would continue flying the Warthog, but without the combat missions that had defined her career for the past several years. It would be an adjustment, transitioning from an environment where every sortie had tactical significance to one where training and readiness were the primary focus. But it was also necessary, a chance to step back from the sustained operational tempo and recover some of the normalcy that long deployments eroded. She arrived at her new assignment 3 weeks later, checking in with the squadron and beginning the process of integration into a unit that had heard about her but didn't know her personally. The squadron commander was a lieutenant colonel who had flown A-10s in Iraq and who understood the culture of the close air support community. He welcomed Flint with the straightforward professionalism that characterized good commanders. "Captain Brennan, good to have you. I've read your file and heard the stories. We're glad to have someone with your experience in the squadron." Flint responded carefully, aware that reputation could create expectations that were difficult to maintain. "Thank you, sir. Looking forward to contributing however I can." The lieutenant colonel smiled slightly. "I know what you're thinking, that everyone expects you to be some kind of superhero because of what happened in Afghanistan. Don't worry about that. What I need from you is solid tactical flying, good judgment, and help bringing up the less experienced pilots. The heroics are optional." Flint appreciated the directness. "Understood, sir. I can do that." Over the following months, she settled into the rhythm of a training squadron, flying practice missions that simulated combat scenarios without the real consequences, working with younger pilots who were learning the intricacies of close air support, and slowly adjusting to a pace that allowed for normal sleep and predictable schedules. It was different from deployment, less intense, but also less purposeful in ways that took getting used to. The younger pilots approached her with a mixture of respect and curiosity, wanting to hear about the missions that had earned her reputation, but also uncertain how to ask. Flint handled these interactions with the same understated approach she brought to most things, answering questions honestly but without embellishment, focusing on the technical lessons rather than the dramatic elements. One young lieutenant asked the question that many of them were thinking during a briefing on damage assessment procedures. "Ma'am, when you were flying that damaged A-10 in Afghanistan, how did you know when to keep going and when it would have been better to eject?" Flint considered the question carefully because it was important, and because the answer had implications for how these pilots would make their own decisions in future combat. The decision to stay with a damaged aircraft isn't just about ego or commitment to the mission. It's about honest assessment of what the aircraft can still do, what the tactical situation requires, and whether you staying in the fight makes more difference than you getting out safely. She paused, making sure they were following. In that specific case, I had assessed that I still had control authority, that I had sufficient fuel to remain on station for a defined period, and that there were no other assets available to provide support to the ground force. Those three factors together meant staying was the right call. If any one of them had been different, the calculation would have changed. Another pilot, a captain with limited combat experience, asked the follow-up. "But how did you know your assessment was accurate? How did you know the aircraft wouldn't just fail catastrophically?" Flint's answer was honest. "I didn't know with certainty, but I understood the A-10 systems well enough to have high confidence in my assessment, and I monitored the aircraft's performance continuously to detect any changes that would require a boarding. You can't eliminate risk in combat aviation, but you can make informed decisions based on knowledge and observation." The discussion continued for another 20 minutes, with Flint walking them through the decision tree she had used, the indicators she had monitored, and the points where she would have ejected if conditions had deteriorated further. It was exactly the kind of tactical knowledge that the weapons school would have wanted her to teach, but she was doing it here, in a line squadron, with pilots who would carry these lessons into their own combat deployments. The squadron commander, who had been observing the discussion, spoke up at the end. "This is valuable instruction, and I want to formalize it. Captain Brennan, I'm designating you as the squadron weapons and tactics officer. You'll be responsible for developing and delivering tactical training to all our pilots." Flint accepted the assignment because it made sense, and because she recognized that her experience had value beyond her individual flying. Over the next year, she built a comprehensive training program that incorporated lessons from her combat experience, focusing on decision-making under pressure, damage assessment procedures, and the integration of air and ground operations. She flew regularly, maintaining her own proficiency while also evaluating other pilots and providing feedback that was direct and constructive. The younger pilots began to understand that Flint's reputation wasn't just about one dramatic mission, but about consistent application of tactical skill and sound judgment across hundreds of sorties. They learned from watching her fly, from her debriefs, from the way she approached problems with analytical precision that never lost sight of the human factors involved. And gradually, without seeking it, Flint became the unofficial standard for what good A-10 flying looked like in the squadron. 3 years after leaving Afghanistan, Flint was promoted to major and given command of a flight within the squadron. It was a leadership position that came with administrative responsibilities alongside flying duties, requiring her to balance tactical operations with personnel management and strategic planning. She approached command with the same methodical competence she brought to flying, establishing clear expectations, providing consistent feedback, and building a flight culture that emphasized technical proficiency and tactical judgment. Her flight became known within the squadron for high standards and strong performance, not because Flint demanded perfection, but because she modeled excellence and her pilots wanted to meet that standard. The young lieutenants and captains under her command knew the stories about her Afghanistan missions, but more importantly, they saw how she flew every training sortie with full commitment, how she debriefed mistakes without personal criticism, and how she advocated for her pilots when they needed support. Leadership suited her in ways she hadn't entirely expected. The responsibility for others' development and success carried its own satisfaction, different from the immediate gratification of a successful combat mission, but meaningful in ways that accumulated over time. She watched pilots progress from basic proficiency to tactical expertise, saw them deploy to combat zones and return with their own experiences, and recognized that her influence extended beyond her individual flying. The squadron commander, now a full colonel, called her into his office one morning with news that she had been anticipating. "Major Brennan, the weapons school invitation has come around again. This time it's not a request but a directive. The Air Force needs experienced instructors, and your name is at the top of the list." Flint had known this was coming eventually. 3 years in the squadron, successful command experience, demonstrated ability to teach and develop other pilots. It was the natural progression for someone with her record. "Sir, I understand. When do they want me?" The colonel smiled. "You're not going to argue about staying tactical this time." Flint shook her head. "No, sir. 3 years ago, I wasn't ready to step away from operational flying. Now I understand that the best way I can contribute is by teaching others. The mission hasn't changed, just my role in accomplishing it." The colonel nodded with satisfaction. "Good answer. You report to Nellie's in 3 months. Make sure your replacement is ready to take over the flight." The assignment to the weapons school marked a transition in Flint's career, moving her from direct tactical operations to the development of doctrine and training that would influence how the entire A-10 community approached close air support. She arrived at Nellie's Air Force Base in Nevada and began the intensive instructor qualification process, learning not just how to fly at an expert level, but how to teach others to reach that same standard. The weapons school culture was demanding and precise, focused on tactical excellence and intellectual rigor. Flint thrived in the weapons school environment because it matched her natural approach to aviation: analytical, thorough, and focused on continuous improvement. She taught courses on close air support integration, combat damage assessment, and tactical decision-making under pressure, using her own experiences as case studies while being careful not to position herself as exceptional. The goal was to teach principles that any competent pilot could apply, not to suggest that her specific actions were the only correct approach. The students who went through her courses came from squadrons across the Air Force, each bringing different experience levels and perspectives. Flint adapted her teaching to meet them where they were, challenging experienced pilots to refine their techniques while building foundational skills in newer ones. Her reputation preceded her, but she established credibility through demonstration rather than authority, flying with students and showing them exactly what good tactical employment looked like. One of her students, a captain named Rodriguez who had recently returned from deployment, asked a question during a debrief that got to the heart of what the weapons school was trying to teach. "Ma'am, you teach us to make tactical decisions based on mission requirements and aircraft capabilities. But how do you teach judgment? How do you help someone know when to push past normal limits and when to recognize that the limit is absolute?" Flint answered thoughtfully, because it was the central question of tactical aviation. "Judgment comes from understanding the principles deeply enough that you can apply them to situations that don't match the textbook exactly. I can't give you a formula that covers every scenario, but I can help you develop the analytical framework to assess risk, evaluate options, and make informed decisions quickly." She paused, then continued. "The key is honest self-assessment. You have to know your own capabilities and your aircraft's capabilities well enough to recognize when you're operating within margins and when you're guessing. And you have to be willing to accept that sometimes the right decision is to abort, to say the mission can't be accomplished safely with available resources." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "But you stayed in Afghanistan when the safe decision was to leave." Flint acknowledged that directly. "I did, because I assessed that I could still provide effective support and that the ground force needed it desperately. But that assessment was based on specific knowledge of my aircraft's condition, my fuel state, and the tactical situation. If any of those factors had been different, the right decision would have been different. She made eye contact with the entire class. Don't use my specific actions as a template for all situations. Use the decision-making process I followed as a framework for your own judgment. That's what the weapons school is teaching, not specific answers, but how to find the right answer for each unique situation. Flint spent 4 years at the weapons school, teaching hundreds of students and contributing to the development of tactics and procedures that would shape how the A-10 community approached close air support for the next generation. She was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given increasing responsibility within the school, eventually becoming the director of the Close Air Support Division. It was a position of significant influence, allowing her to shape curriculum, evaluate instructor performance, and ensure that the training remained grounded in combat reality rather than academic theory. During her time at the weapons school, the A-10 faced recurring questions about its future in the Air Force inventory. Budget pressures and competing priorities led to proposals to retire the Warthog fleet, replacing it with more modern multi-role aircraft that could perform close air support alongside other missions. The debate played out in Congress, in Pentagon briefings, and in the aviation community, with passionate arguments on both sides. Flint didn't involve herself publicly in the political debate, but she focused her teaching on demonstrating why the A-10 remained relevant. She emphasized the aircraft's unique capabilities, the ability to operate from austere airfields, to loiter over the battlefield for extended periods, to survive damage that would down other aircraft, and to deliver precision fires in close proximity to friendly forces. She taught students that close air support wasn't just about weapons delivery, but about the integration of air and ground operations, about building trust through demonstrated reliability, about understanding that sometimes the most important thing a pilot could do was stay on station, even when it would be easier to leave. Her students carried those lessons back to their squadrons, spreading an understanding of close air support that went beyond technical proficiency to encompass the values and commitment that made the mission effective. And gradually, the argument for the A-10's continued relevance became stronger, supported not by abstract theory, but by the practical reality of pilots who understood what the aircraft could do and why that capability mattered. After 4 years at the weapons school, Flint received orders to return to operational flying, this time as commander of an entire A-10 squadron. It was the culmination of a career trajectory that had started with a young lieutenant learning to fly the Warthog and had progressed through combat operations, instruction, and leadership development. She took command of the squadron with clear vision and established expectations, building on everything she had learned about tactical excellence, personnel development, and organizational culture. The squadron thrived under her leadership, becoming known as one of the highest-performing units in the A-10 community. Flint flew regularly, maintaining her own proficiency while also evaluating her pilots and ensuring they met the standards she had helped establish at the weapons school. She deployed the squadron to combat operations in the Middle East, providing close air support to ground forces fighting against insurgent groups that had proliferated in the power vacuums of regional conflicts. During one of those deployments, Flint found herself in a situation that echoed the mission from years earlier in Afghanistan. A special operations team was pinned down by enemy fire in a Syrian valley, taking casualties and calling desperately for air support. Flint was the on-call close air support asset, and she responded immediately, coordinating with the ground controller and assessing the tactical situation as she flew toward the contact area. The enemy forces were well positioned in fortified locations, with clear fields of fire that made any ground movement suicidal. The Special Operations Team needed precision fire support close enough to suppress the enemy, but far enough to avoid fratricide. It was exactly the kind of mission the A-10 was built for, and Flint executed it with the accumulated expertise of over 1,000 combat hours. She made multiple gun runs, each one delivered with surgical precision, walking her fire along enemy positions while maintaining constant communication with the ground controller. She took small arms fire during one pass, heard the impacts against the titanium bathtub, and continued the attack without deviation because the team on the ground needed her focused and effective. The mission lasted 43 minutes, ending only when the Special Operations team was able to break contact and move to a secure exfil point. Flint escorted them the entire way, maintaining overwatch until they were airborne in their extraction helicopters. Her A-10 had taken 7 hits, none of them critical, all of them testament to the aircraft's ability to absorb damage and keep fighting. When she landed back at base and climbed out of the cockpit, her maintenance chief was waiting with an expression that mixed concern and pride. "Ma'am, you've got holes in the tail section again." Flint looked at the damage and smiled slightly. "Seems to be a recurring theme." The chief shook his head. "Most pilots would be rattled by taking fire. You act like it's just another day at the office." Flint's response was simple and true. "It is another day at the office. This is what we do." That evening, she received a message from the Special Operations Team Commander, thanking her for the support and noting that her actions had directly prevented casualties that would have been catastrophic. The message was professional and factual, but Flint understood the weight behind the words. She had done for that team what she had done for the Marines years earlier in Afghanistan: stayed when staying was hard, delivered fire when fire was needed, and refused to leave until the mission was complete. It was the continuation of a pattern that had defined her career, the commitment to close air support that went beyond technical proficiency to something more fundamental about duty and service. Flint sat in her quarters that night, looking at the challenge coin the Marines had given her years earlier, thinking about the accumulation of missions and moments that had brought her to this point. She was a lieutenant colonel now, a squadron commander, a weapons school graduate, and someone whose name was known throughout the A-10 community. But fundamentally, she was still the pilot who had chosen to stay in that Afghan valley when leaving would have been safer, who had flown a damaged aircraft until it literally had nothing left to give, who believed that ground forces deserved a pilot who wouldn't quit on them when things got difficult. That belief hadn't changed. The aircraft had evolved slightly, the technology had improved incrementally, and the conflicts had shifted geography and enemies. But the essential mission remained constant: provide close air support to ground forces who needed it, stay on station as long as possible, and come home only when the job was done. Flint understood that this commitment had costs, that it pushed her past limits that were designed to protect pilots, that it occasionally put her in situations where survival was uncertain. But she also understood that some costs were worth paying, that some missions justified risks that normal calculations would reject, and that the trust between air and ground forces was built on demonstrated willingness to stay when staying was hard. She had become a symbol of that trust, a call sign that meant reliability and commitment. And while she never sought that symbolic role, she honored it by continuing to fly the way she had always flown: with competence, with courage, and with an unwavering focus on the mission that brought her into the sky in the first place. The story of Flint had spread beyond military circles now, told in articles and documentaries that tried to capture what had happened in that Afghan valley and why it mattered. She participated in the interviews when directed, but always deflected attention from herself to the aircraft, to the mission, to the ground forces who were the reason close air support existed. She understood that her story resonated because it represented something people wanted to believe: that individual action mattered, that commitment could overcome obstacles, that choosing duty over safety was still valued in a world that often prioritized self-preservation. Those themes were real in her experience, but they were also incomplete. She had been lucky, surviving situations where luck played as much role as skill. The A-10 had performed exactly as engineered, but engineering had margins, and those margins could have failed. The missions had succeeded, but success was never guaranteed, and failure would have been catastrophic. Still, the story persisted and grew, becoming part of the cultural legacy of the A-10 community, and a benchmark for what close air support at its best could achieve. Flint accepted that legacy while remaining focused on the present, on the squadron she commanded, on the pilots she developed, on the missions still to fly. Because ultimately, legacy was built not through single dramatic moments, but through consistent application of principles over time, through choosing the hard right over the easy wrong, through staying on station until the mission was complete. That was Flint's real story, written not in citations and awards, but in the accumulated trust of ground forces who knew that when they called for support and heard that call sign on the radio, someone was coming who wouldn't leave until they were safe. And that trust, built mission by mission and deployment by deployment, was the legacy that mattered most.